Hello and welcome to the new episode of Threat Hunting series. I know it's been long that I've uploaded a video. Apologies for that. I'll try to stick to the schedule and create more such videos. But let's quickly dive into hypothesis and understand how hypotheses work. We'll try to finish up all the theory first before we dive into actual hunting and practicals and labs. So this again will be a theory video. We'll have, I think, one or two more such theory before we dive into threat hunting and start setting up the lab, setting up the logs, and start testing hypotheses, creating reports, and possibly go with the flow. So let's quickly deep dive into designing good hypothesis. I think we discussed on what actually drives a hypothesis, how do you create a hypothesis, but it's equally important to understand how to create a good hypothesis and not create any random hypothesis and go and test it and realize later that this is not working out, or be in a threat hunting rabbit hole where you realize that you know threat hunting but actually you don't, right? So let us fix how to create a good hypothesis and then possibly create a few to understand how you can do it in your day-to-day life. We'll get started by understanding the characteristics of hypothesis. So there are multiple characteristics of a hypothesis. These characteristics define and govern how a hypothesis behave and how you can actually tune the hypothesis to align to these core characteristics. It is important to understand them because if any or one of them fails, possibly your hypothesis might lead you to a wrong rabbit hole or might be misleading, right? So what we'll do is we'll go over them one by one and try to understand what they mean, and then try to create a hypothesis and understand how do we know that this is working out. So the first one is falsifiable. This means that your hunt or hypothesis is not absolute and there is some amount of deniability or falsifiability to it. That means it could also be proved that your hypothesis is wrong at one point. Say, for example, your hypothesis doesn't say that we have been fished. It's not an outcome of a definite event. It's an assumption, and assumptions can be true or false. So that false component needs to be there. If you feel that your hypothesis don't have false component or they cannot be falsified, then you are not doing it right, because then your assumption is not an assumption, it's an actual artifact or an event, then which leads back to it's not threat hunting, right? It's detection or basically an alert through which you're working backwards. So falsifiability is important and is crucial. Another thing is there should be a recursive process for your hypothesis, right? There should be enough elements in your hypothesis that needs to be fixed every time you run it and realize that there is a true positive or a false positive, or there are other parameters or caveats that drive or influence the parameters. For example, if you feel there is an attacker tactic or a technique, and you realize this technique changes when the operating system changes, you should be able to go back to your hypothesis and change that or make it more specific, right, to an operating system, or change it to align to the new behavior. So the recursive or the recursion should always be there, and your hypothesis should allow that, right? And that is important. Unless you have a very specific hypothesis that doesn't require any tuning later and is driven by a question possibly asked by, say, a team manager, right? So for example, your management asks you a very specific question that have we been compromised by CV ABC. Now in this scenario, you create the hypothesis, or your hypothesis would be very specific and you possibly don't tune it again and again, but there's still amount of tuning that would be required, but can be a scenario where you don't need to. Ideally, for 99.99% of cases, recursive process is important, and you should have a hypothesis that supports recursion for tuning and fixing of it. Another thing could be expressed in simple high-level language. If you are able to express your hypothesis in simple layman terms and also express it in simple language, then you have done a good job in making it simple enough that it's testable, falsifiable, and easy to understand, right? Again, you don't want to write 100 lines of SQL query with multiple nesting and joins and say that this is my hypothesis, which is not understandable by anybody, which is not understandable by any management, which is not understandable by team peers, right? So that's you're creating basically a bottleneck or a block, right? So if your hypothesis is expressible in simple high level language, it's good. The query is analytics and is not a hypothesis, right? It's the corresponding analytics that you write or query that you write to your hypothesis that gives you the capability to test it in your system, right? So hypothesis is simple high level language. If you have a complex complex hypothesis, what you can simply do is take a more base level hypothesis of it. For example, I have a very complex hypothesis that say employees are getting phished from ABC regions. They are getting emails in which has attachments that are PDF, malicious in nature, redirects. Now I keep on adding specifics to it. It becomes lengthy. So you can derive a base hypothesis that's simple enough. What we are hunting is basically phishing of employees via compromised or via malicious attachments sent via email. Now this is a simpler language and a simpler hypothesis. Now you can, from a base hypothesis, you can derive a very specific hypothesis, or you can derive multiple specific hypotheses, where you can say the base hypothesis is phishing via attachments, or phishing via hyperlinks. We have spear phishing, we have whaling, right? You can have different specifics added to it, and all of them forms different hypotheses for you to test, but you have a base simple hypothesis that you can explain anywhere when needed. Now going to the fourth one, your hypothesis shouldn't be vague, right? It should have enough supporting evidence to say this is technically correct, at least technically correct, if not proven to be true, that this can happen. For example, if my hypothesis says Windows machines are getting compromised via scripts that are written in Apple script format, possibly not true, right? Because you can't run Apple script on Windows machine, and that is not support, and no intelligence or research or report actually supports that. Then your hypothesis is still a hypothesis, but it's not technically correct. So ensure that your hypothesis has intelligence, research, report, or in previous citing, previous alert, previous detection to support the underlying logic that you're trying to convey, right? The fifth one and the most important one after falsifiable in this characteristic list is specific and measurable. I believe your threat hunt needs to be very specific. Otherwise, you are just chasing a few hundred leads from millions of logs that will not lead you to where you want to be. So unless what you're doing is baselining, right? When you have a baselining activity going on, what you're doing is distilling those 100 million events into proper sightings and baselines or insights that you want to drive, and there could be hundreds of insights. But when you're hunting, you are just chasing a simple trackable behavior, and that behavior could be measurable, right? Say for example, it shouldn't be I ran a hunt and I don't know what happened, what metrics. So when you run a query, you ensure that you have what you're chasing, you have what you are trying to measure. I'm trying to measure the amount of incidents or the amount of sightings where we have a hyperlink that's redirecting to a different out of domain URL, right? So it's measurable, it's specific. I have 10 sightings. From 10 sightings, I drill down. So it's specific and it's measurable, and it's important that your hypothesis have that. It should be testable and drives outcome. The last one, right? I cannot define a hypothesis that is not testable. For example, people, when they step out of office, they find USB drives lying here and there or on the road, and they pick up and plug it into office laptops. Now this hypothesis have some component that is testable, some component that is not testable. I cannot test where did they pick this USB drive from, right? So that entire portion becomes non-testable. So when you're defining the hypothesis, don't make it vague. Try to keep it testable. Try to define specifics, and also see that it drives outcome. Now your hypothesis should give you enough points that you can drive a incident, or drive an alert, or drive a sighting to understand what happened, what did not happen. So for example, if you have a phishing mail hunt, and you realize there is a mail, you should be able to craft it as an incident, or an alert, or a detection, or anything, right? There could be multiple different outcomes that you can try from a hunt, but ensure that it has an outcome. And it shouldn't be that you test and you find some out sightings and you don't do anything after that, or there's no other way to proceed, right? And there would be times when you would need to liaise with the other teams to understand, but that's still an outcome, right? You are still liaising with other team, figuring out what happened, what did not happen, how the technicality of this works, and possibly derive some, or build some policies, or build some controls to let that behavior not happen again. So whatever it is, ensure that you drive some outcome out of it. And all of this is only possible when you have a really good hypothesis in place. If your hypothesis doesn't support all of this, or possibly one or two of them is failing, it's important that you go back and tune it, right? So we'll now take example of a good and a bad hypothesis, and understand what was good in it, what was bad in it, how we can make a bad hypothesis better, and try to work through it. So we'll take a simple hypothesis that attackers compromise corporate employees by sending them emails that have malicious links to harvest credentials. And it's a fairly simple hypothesis that is based out of phishing, and phishing via malicious link, where employees have to enter their credentials, so an attacker is harvesting them, right? This is simple. Let's first understand why this hypothesis is bad. For most of the use cases and most of the people, this hypothesis might seem okay, but it is not. We'll understand why it is bad. Uh, if you see or read the nature of the hypothesis, the behavior says if a mail is received and has a hyperlink, then there is a compromise, right? The only possible way to write an analytics based on just this hypothesis and without any other domain expertise or knowledge is if there is a link in the email shortlisted as your citing. Now this creates a lot of inputs, and in turn creates a lots of false positive. This also means if you have a legitimate email with hyperlink, that is also counted in that output, so it's a false positive. So the number of sightings that you get from, say, 1,000,000 mails is possibly, again, too much for you to audit and understand where is the threat, right? So this makes this hypothesis difficult to execute. Now from an execution perspective, this is difficult, but if you introduce more specificity and falsifiability, then the hypothesis improves. You ask how? Let me explain this. Um, by introducing specifics such as mail is received from an external entity. Let us consider that all our hypothesis assumes that the mail is coming from outside, and we are eliminating all the internal mail transfers, possibly reducing the data set that we are looking by half, right? Because a lot of mails will only happen from employee to employee, and we don't want to take a look on it. We assume that there is no insider threat component happening, so that reduces our data set. Of course, you can take a different route as well. You can just say that there is an insider threat and we just take employee to employee emails for hunting, but that's a different hunt altogether, right? The second specificity that we can introduce is hyperlink points to an unknown non-organizational domain, right? For example, a lot of time emails will have URLs or hyperlinks or links to the organization's own website, own hosted resources and stuff, right? So you would want emails which has hyperlinks that don't point to your organizational resources. How you can do that is possibly doing a filter in your query where hyperlinks do not contain ABC domains. right? And that is how you reduce the data set again by half, possibly half, right? So from a million records you are coming down to 250k, right? So this 250k records can now um, further be reduced, right? So the it's the whole gamut of it's the whole process of applying specifics and then keep on reducing your data sets so that you have a few records to work with where it's auditable, right? If I give you 100 k log and ask you to find threat from it, you still have to reduce it again. Either you will be chunking, you will be doing say a set number of record audit per day, and you will possibly take n number of days to finish it. But what you can do is basically, or possibly write an automation as well, that is also possible. But the idea is to keep on reducing using specifics so that you have a very specific thing that you are looking for, a hunt that you are running, and that yields some outliers, some anomaly, because you don't want 100 different false positives to be popping up. That makes no sense for a hunting process, right? So you would keep on doing this recursion and improving via specifics and introduce falsifiability, right? It's another technique. What you can do is you can reduce um, known false positives, right? For example, legitimate vendors sending emails. um, Now legitimate vendors sending emails will have might have non-company or non-hosted resource links coming from outside, so it's a hit in your hypothesis or a hunt. But you can reduce them since you already know that this could be a false positive scenario. But you imagine if you're running this query, you would have these hits coming in the first place. It's only when you realize this is happening and that is why I'm getting large amount of results, you would reduce them. So the falsifiability is actually checked because you have a mail that is hyperlink to and that is from an external entity and points to an unknown domain. So but it's not a threat, right? So it's a false case, so you have falsifiability check, but then you would reduce that. And the falsifiability keeps on reducing when you keep on improving your hypothesis, and this is how you reach a golden hypothesis that could be tested, has a very little amount of falsifiability, has high amount of specificity, and you have less number of outputs or sightings to work with, and it basically gives you leads you to find threats faster, right? um, we'll take a look at more hypotheses that could be good or bad, and we'll see what is the bad version, what is the good version of it, and I have some 5 examples here. um, we'll go through them one by one. If you can understand, the example one says attackers might be using malware to compromise our systems as a base level hypothesis, and in a very general layman term, okay, but still bad, doesn't have any specificity. What are you actually looking for, right? A good one could be adversaries leveraging living off the land binaries. May use the run DLL32.exe to execute malicious DLLs from non-standard location to evade detection. Now there are multiple things out of which you can make specifics here. First of all, your process name is run DLL32.exe. Your execution path is non-standard location, right? And then if you run these two, you would get a set of findings with command lines, audit those command lines with what they are executing, right? And that is how you will be able to figure out what is bad and what is not bad, right? Living off the land is a class of attack, and I think as a threat hunter you should definitely go and learn about them if you don't already know about them. Another bad could be attackers might be using PowerShell for malicious activity. Points towards PowerShell, but still lacks a lot of specificity, right? Threat actors may use obfuscated PowerShell commands to execute remote payloads via invoke expression or download string. Now I have two command line parameters here: invoke expression and download string, and obfuscated PowerShell, right? So PowerShell commands with these strings is something that you are actually looking for, right? Download string generally used with PowerShell could mean that attacker is trying to get download a loader or a payload onto this machine, right? So again, this is a better version. We should check for lateral movement, right? This is a very generic statement and not even a hypothesis. What you can do is basically improve it by understanding how lateral movement. So you have to research on the technique or a tactic that you really want to dive in and fixate yourself on finding a specific behavior. Now this specific behavior is towards something that you keep on tuning to figure out if there is a threat or not, right? So the better version would be PSXX or WMI execution to move laterally by executing network commands for non-administrative workstations. So you can directly remove administrative workstations. You can filter on PSXX and WMI and audit the command line parameters to understand if there is a lateral movement happening. Similarly, if you see example 4, malware might be executing on endpoints. Again, a very generic statement and not a hypothesis. Specific would be I'm looking at MSI exec.exe for a malicious execution. Another would be malicious scripts may be running in our environment. So again, not a hypothesis, right? What kind of scripts, what extension, what form of scripts are running, from where are they running, all of these, when what program is actually executing those scripts, if all of these are specified, you have a testable hypothesis, right? So a VBS or a JS script executed via W script or C script from a non-standard location is a good, very good testable hypothesis, right? And this is how you see the difference between a bad and a good hypothesis, and how you can see how specificity improves the testability and falsifiability of a hypothesis. And the last thing that we will take a look before we close out for this theory session is biases in building threat hunting hypotheses. It's important that we discuss biases because this is something that governs how you are building hypothesis and is not clearly visible until unless it's audited or highlighted by somebody else or later down in the process. So I'll just highlight biases so that you keep a check on these while you are developing those hypotheses, right? So biases can be of two types in threat hunting process. One of them is based out of intelligence source that you're considering for building this hypothesis, and another one is basically bias as a human that you're working, right? So bias as a threat hunter that you have been deployed. So bias in intelligence can be of three types. One is visibility, another is victim, third is novelty. One of the bias in intelligence, the first one, visibility, means that you are only biasing your hunts based off what intelligence that you were able to collect, right? So the intelligence that you were able to collect, are they fulfilling your requirements? Are they complete in nature? Are they biased in itself, right? For example, I'm collecting an intelligence report, say from ABC company, who generally focuses on um, a specific kind of an operating system, say Mac, right? So my bias of that threat working in Windows environment is already present because I'm considering the intelligence from such a source, right? So visibility introduces some amount of bias. Another is victim, right? It introduces bias because you might be only looking from a set perspective. Sometimes it's not bias, sometimes you have this specificity required that you are only looking for a certain victim. For example, people working in, say, manufacturing industry would only take reports of or intelligence reports for companies or actors working in manufacturing sector, right? Or compromises in manufacturing sector. So there is a victim bias. Sometimes it's required, sometimes it automatically creeps in. Generally you should avoid it. Why? Because a certain actor, if is not a targeted threat attacker, would not care about attacking only certain industry, or a victim would do a massive damage across all other sectors as well. Say for example, let's take an example of ransomware. A ransomware operator might not only focus on manufacturing industry or fintech or any specific BFSI, any specific sector, but the goal is to spread ransomware, get ransom, right? So regardless of the sector that you are in, you would be getting ransomware spreading. You would see ransomware spreading all across, and you should collect reports and intelligence from all different sectors. So your bias shouldn't be across victim, and that is something that you should keep in check. Another would be novelty, and this is something that I've seen a lot of times. People tend to focus on novel attack patterns that are very new, very different, um, very very different from what we already know, highlighted, glorified, and this introduces a bias, because then you are overlooking all the possible other threat attack patterns that might be susceptible in your environment, right? So you are having a novelty bias. So while taking an intelligence or considering an intelligence or taking a source, consider that you get ask yourself questions, or ask your teammate or colleague questions around if you are having any of such biases in picture. Um, Again, as a threat hunter, there are two types of biases that I've generally seen. One is availability. You only tend to hunt and check on what is available for you. For example, you only have, say, endpoint logs. So you will only focus on endpoint based threats. But it isn't that there are only endpoint based threats. There could be network based threats, there could be SaaS, there could be cloud infrastructure, where there could be different types of threats. So if you are not having those logs available, identify them as gaps, drive to work and close them, right? As a threat hunter, your job is to close as many gaps as possible. So availability bias is something that takes on very easily over threat hunters. Oh, I have only these three types of logs, so I'll only find threats possible in these three log sources. While it's an easy fruit to tackle, uh, it's a low hanging fruit, but I would suggest that you also see that you're expanding towards a larger gamut of threats, right? And the second one would be reference bias, right? Derives again from intelligence. What you are referring to, is it fulfilling? Say, for example, me as a threat hunter would have a habit of always going back and checking a certain threat intelligence platform or a blog, and only hunt exclusively from those uh, listed intelligence on on that platform, because I believe they are doing good and their reports are complete and their reports are executable, doable. So I'll always go back and refer them, which might introduce certain kind of bias. um, I know everybody has their own favorite blog or website or intelligence platform, but then again, favorite word itself calls bias, right? So see that you are not having that bias again. Very difficult to come out of this, but again, ask your colleagues for their opinion around what they think about your hypothesis that you have created. Let's give them sources, give them data, and they would be able to easily call out, okay, why have you not done this, why have you not referred that, or can we also look across other sources? And all of that is helpful while crafting that hypothesis, right? So we'll close off the session today here, and today we discussed around how to design a great hypothesis, examples of some bad hypotheses, characteristics of some good hypotheses, and what are biases and how they can be dealt with. I hope this session was helpful to you, and I'll come back with a new video next week where we'll discuss more on hypotheses and try to execute them. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.